Welcome back. We are the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael.
And I am James.
And today we are going back in the beginning. And well, not the complete beginning, but we're pretty close. Today we are discussing Planet of Giants, which was the first story of the second season of Doctor Who, written by Louis Marks, who, interestingly, also wrote both Day of the Daleks and The Mask of Mandragora, two stories which we've actually previously discussed, which is really random. A third Doctor story, a fourth Doctor story, and then a first Doctor story, none of the three of which, I would just say, have particularly great reputations. I'm sure the reputation of Planet of Giants is perfectly fine, but
there are some people who think it's a last or first Doctor story.
Yeah, I mean, when you think, though, of like great first Doctor stories, Planet of Giants probably doesn't come to mind. And that may partially be because it's just a 3-episode story. It initially aired between October to November 1964, with, of course, William Hartnell as the first Doctor and the original farm. Yes, yeah, it's James always enjoyed the farm. We'll talk about them. You could just hear the despair in his voice. With William Russell as Ian, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara, and Carole Ann Ford as Susan. And as I said, this is just a 3-episode story, which is one of the only 3-episode stories in Classic Who.
I mean, there was some in the later seasons. Battlefield might have been 3 parts.
Oh yeah,
like way later.
Yeah, Battlefield, Ghostlight, maybe the 2 Doctors.
2 Doctors. I mean, keep in mind that was when they were 45 minutes each, so that seems quite long. But also, Silver Nemesis is 3 parts.
Yeah. So, at least insofar as like 6s and 7s, you're definitely sort of an outlier. This was initially, though, meant to be 4 parts, I think. And if James, you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
I mean, I don't have all that much to say about it. It's just, apparently, it was originally meant to be 4 parts. They recorded it as 4 parts, I think. But then, I'm not sure if it was due to issues of, they didn't have as many weeks to have episodes as they thought. Or maybe it's just because the BBC producer liked the Dalek invasion of Earth a lot more than this one. Which, of course, is the next story after this one. But this got cut down from 4 episodes to 3 episodes, and honestly, you can really tell they basically spliced episodes 3 and 4 into one episode. That happens to be about 3 minutes longer than the other 2, but you can definitely tell they were spliced. Like, it was so obvious watching it that, hey, this is kind of interesting oddity. I mean, I noticed there's a couple of strange oddities in the first 2 parts, which I don't think were actually attached, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I am. But certainly the last episode was really stepped up to try to make a cohesive story out of them. And it's impressive they did as well as they actually managed.
And there is one place where I think the cut is most notable in the last episode, which we'll talk about a bit later on, just because I think it was so interesting. And it was probably the least smooth thing I've seen in this classic story. But before we get there, I was going to read the plot, and I was going to read it from the back of the 2012 DVD. We watched this from the complete season 2 on Blu-ray, which we have. But I also prefer reading the plots from, I guess, let me put it this way. We've had the Planet of Giants DVD, this solo DVD, for much longer than we've had the Blu-ray, so it just feels more natural to me. So the plot of Planet of Giants. The TARDIS doors open accidentally while the ship is still in flight. Although they have arrived back on Earth in the 1960s, a time they have been trying to return to since the Owl Mat, the travelers soon realize that something is very wrong. The Doctor, Ian, Barbara, and Susan discover that they have all been reduced in size, and the world they are now exploring has dangers at every turn. The dangers, of course, being what you would expect if you happen to be shrunken down. I think they were like an inch tall or something. I forget the exact measurement, but they weren't. They're pretty small fellows.
Yeah, I think it's an inch tall. I thought it was maybe not quite right because they looked smaller than an inch in a lot of scenes compared to what was around them. But maybe it was, in fact, an inch. No, it's exactly what you'd expect of any science fiction story where people are miniaturized. I'm sure Magic Scuba's had more than one episode like this.
Well, yeah, see, and I actually wanted to touch on that just a little bit because I've mentioned before that I come from sort of like a horror background, and some of these miniaturized human things are also sometimes categorized as horror movies. I think one of the most famous ones is The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is a late 50s movie. I've not actually seen that one. There are two movies I thought worth mentioning, though. If you enjoy Planet of Giants, movies that you might want to check out. There's a I believe it's 1940 movie called Dr. Cyclops. It's actually one of the earlier horror movies that has complete technicolor, so has some charm to it. But Dr. Cyclops has some character. And there is also late 50s Attack of the Puppet People, which I didn't particularly enjoy, but has shrunken hamburgers in it. So this type of, I guess, trope in science fiction being shrunken and dealing with like, hey, this small caterpillar is now like a dangerous animal, or hey, that cute cat is now going to eat people. Which, in fact, the cliffhanger of the first episode is the doctor and his people being face to face with this, of course, giant cat. So he looked charming.
I'm kind of surprised that cat didn't pop up anywhere else, but maybe that was one of the things that was cut.
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't be surprised because they had like 20 other minutes of stuff that we didn't see, which was apparently reconstructed in some form, but we haven't seen it, though admittedly I'm sort of curious.
Yeah, apparently they did some quote-unquote animation reconstruction of episodes 3 and 4 based on the original script and some newly recorded audio that is in fact on the 2012 DVD. But because my brother and I prefer watching things in the original form, that's why we watched Day of the Daleks, not with the newer special effects, or I believe they even fixed up the Dalek voices. But we just prefer to watch the aired 3-part story instead of the reconstructed 4-part story. So it also sounds quite interesting to me as well. And even though I do not have unlimited time, it might be worth looking at that one day.
One thing I sort of appreciate about this story is, despite the science fiction trappings, that the Doctor and his people get shrunk and they have to contend with, well, a more dangerous nature, it just hit me that perhaps the most well-known example to the modern day culture might be Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Hey, that's a good movie. And the sequels are also surprisingly good.
Yeah,
At least one of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure one of them is like, hey, I blew up the baby, and that was absolutely horrible. I haven't seen the movie in so long, but that might be a little more approachable to some people. But one thing I really liked about the story is, despite the science fiction background, it's primarily sort of like a sort of a crime. I wouldn't say suspense, it's sort of like a crime story. Pretty much there's 3 characters of note aside from the Doctor and the companions. By of note, I mean this first guy, he dies in the first episode, which is much of a spoiler because he doesn't last that long. A guy named Pharaoh, played by Frank Crasher, and he was sort of a gently older guy. I like that guy. Then the other 2 characters, and these characters appear throughout the other 2 episodes, Forrester and Professor Smithers. And it primarily follows the after effects of Forrester killing Pharaoh, reason being that there is a dangerous pesticide that Smithers and Forrester are working on that Pharaoh knew about. He was going to report them to the ministry. It was, well, naturally they're going to be found out. Forrester just took care of it.
And to be a little more specific, Pharaoh was a government inspector who, of course, was watching the production of the pesticide. Once he found out, once he did some tests, you see there's way too dangerous to put into production. It killed a lot more than just the normal pests. It killed even useful insects, if I'm not mistaken. Insofar as you're going to call scary insects useful. I know they serve a purpose. I'm not that foolhardy. But the problem is that the businessman Forrester, who is the most evil-looking businessman of our time, but they usually do look that way. Sorry, hashtag really not sorry. Forrester had already put into production the pesticide, which is what called D96? D6?
Yeah, D6, an insecticide.
Forrester, being a businessman who apparently does not care all about government regulation, had already put into production the pesticide, even though it wasn't approved by the ministry. And so Pharaoh's like, well, I'm sorry about your loss, but I'm still going to have to report it. As for government inspector, I actually quite like the guy. When Forrester tried to bribe him, Pharaoh's like, no, I think I'm done with this conversation. I'm going to be reporting my findings to the ministry. And so, yeah, Forrester just suits him, as you do, with the smallest gun I have ever seen in media.
Yeah, and actually, we'll throw a picture up right here. Yeah, as someone who doesn't know anything about firearms, I'm going to assume a gun like that actually exists, but it does look pretty I must have looked ridiculous, to be honest, but hey, you do what you have to do, I guess, including shooting government agents.
And then hiding the bodies and making up false stories and in fact impersonating the agents after they're dead.
But that may have been the downfall.
It most certainly was, because it was the most sucking impersonation I've ever heard.
So one thing that is notable early on is that as the plot says, the TARDIS door sort of open mid-flight, and the Doctor gets all aggravated and panicked. Like he's like convinced something's wrong. He like tells Susan, "Hey, go check this out. Go check this out." And he's sort of yelling at everyone, as this Doctor sometimes did. He's just a bit aggravated and worried, naturally. Whereas earlier, like in the first couple of episodes, it might have just been his nature. He actually apologizes, at least to Barbara. He apologizes for being snobby, which is sort of something that we would not have seen in earlier versions of this Doctor's behavior, which is sort of nice.
Yeah, I know he eased up a bit after the odds of distraction, but funnily enough, neither Michael nor I have actually listened to Marco Polo. So it's hard to say how much better he is there, and we've only seen the rest of the season only one time. But yeah, it's nice to actually see him apologize to Barbara. I noticed he did apologize to Ian, but I suppose he was being a bit more snappy towards Barbara.
Also, Barbara's of the fairer sex, so she's more emotionally inclined. Speaking of emotionally inclined, actually, no, this is just a small note. I actually don't have any more to say than this, but I always love seeing Susan when she's absolutely hysterical. Like, she cracks me up so much when she's just like shouting and screaming for really no particularly good reason.
No, she has great streaks. I'm not going to try to emulate one because I don't have a good enough microphone.
Like,
But
she just loses her cool so quickly. She is not good in high pressure situations.
which is funny because, of course, the actress hated that about Susan. She did think that she had a great writing, which is one of the reasons she laughed. And that's understandable, but at the same time, for what it is, I find it enjoyable.
And actually, speaking of which, naturally, given that the next story is the Dalek invasion of Earth, this is the second to last story with Susan in it.
It's kind of awkward that she doesn't get to do much in this one.
Yeah, actually, because it's focused. I would say, as far as companions go, it's focused primarily around Barbara in a sort of subplot I want to touch on in detail a bit later. One thing I really enjoyed about this is that when the TARDIS lands and they decide to go outside, once they determine it's safe, they sort of break into two groups. The Doctor and Barbara go off in one direction, trying to sort of get a feel of where they are, because to their knowledge they should be on Earth. And then Ian and Susan go another direction. And at first they think something's wrong with the planet, like, hey, that's a really giant worm, or hey, that's like a really giant ant. They think the animal life around them, insect life, is just much larger than they should be. But then it hits pretty much both groups at the same time that, hey, we're actually just shrunk. And of course the Doctor realizes it and speaks to Barbara about it. And Susan realizes it and speaks to Ian about it. Ian, well, you know Ian, he's like, oh, that's not possible, Susan. Because he's a condescending dick. But
He's not that bad. I've always quite liked Ian, actually. If Ian could have been the companion for like 3 seasons or 8 seasons or 20 seasons, I would have been fine with that.
you know, I like Ian too. But I just like him. Oh, that's not possible, Susan. Of course, Susan's entirely right.
Yeah, you would think that Ian, after 8 stories that were on air, would have finally eased off a bit in what was possible or wasn't.
He could have realized that the student has become the teacher.
To be fair, he kind of knew that from the first episode.
But-
He knows more about science than I ever will, Barbara.
But the interesting thing about that is they did some interesting cuts there where it went from Susan trying to explain to Ian, cutting to Barbara, listening to an explanation from the Doctor, sort of going back and forth. So we get sort of like a complete picture from both of them talking. And that's something that felt a bit, I don't know, it felt a little more modern than what I would have expected from something like this. To be fair, like James sort of alluded to, we've only seen this one once before. So it's not like we have a lot of experience with this one. But I did like the way they went with that.
Yeah, as Luke Rodigan would say, it's quite clever.
That guy, though.
No, I've been thinking about the 2-power dead lad today, actually.
It's not Atmos system. That'd be Atmos system. Guy was he's very high strung.
I don't know who the actor is, but I like him in that role a lot,
He
actually.
would have been a good companion.
I think he would have been a great companion. That would have been a fun arc to try to get him to rejoin humanity, as it were.
Yeah, that actually would have been fun. Going back to what I said about how it seems like it's primarily like almost a crime story. What's really interesting about that is that we as the audience know and understand why Forrester killed Phil. I sort of wish they didn't have both names started with an F, but that's neither here nor there. So as an audience, we understand why we see a sort of long conversation between the two of them. But what's interesting about this is that because the doctor and his companions are so small, they can't, like, they hear the conversations as sort of like a loud rumbling. Like I'm not sure they explained it in the story, but like the pitch of the voice is just way too low for them to actually comprehend what they're saying. So like Ian's actually right there when Pharaoh is killed. He's theoretically capable of hearing the whole conversation, but because he can't comprehend what they're actually saying, they see as like, hey, a dead body, and hey, this guy's been shot, and all they know is, hey, this must be a murderer living in this house. They don't know why, they don't know how, well, they know how, but they don't know anything about it. Whereas, of course, the audience does, which I thought was sort of an interesting element to throw into this.
Yeah, they also knew that they had the great green screen.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I thought the effects for this episode, throughout almost all of it, were actually really good on the whole. I especially like how the TARDIS, when it lands, they think they're in some type of cave system, but they're actually just in the cracks of a...
I just like a cobblestone path.
Yeah, and of course, it's kind of strange that they're not filled in with cement, but I guess they could have it this way if they were. So they thought they were in this type of cave. That's how small they were. That's why I think they have got to be smaller than an inch. Regardless, all the effects look really good, except for the green screen in front of the dead body. That did not look as well. Although there was a hilarious, like, 10-second sequence where Ian takes out his handkerchief, which actually comes up late in the story, now that I think about it, and holds it in front of the dead man's nose to see if he's breathing. And I just thought it was kind of hilarious. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just a terrible green screen where it just looked really funny.
Yeah, and actually we'll have a picture of that up too, just to show the nature of it. And it's actually in that first episode when they're sort of exploring that they run into, like, for instance, like a dead earthworm and some dead ants. And they talk about, oh, we've run into all these dead insects. Now we only see a handful because, well, the budget isn't what it is nowadays. So they've apparently run into tons and tons of dead ants. We saw, like, what, 2, I think?
And I mean, once you see one dead ant, you've seen enough.
Well, yeah, that's completely fair. And that leads into the whole idea we mentioned earlier about there being an insecticide that might be just a tad strong. And it's because of that this is sort of like the first real environmental story of Doctor Who. There's been a handful throughout Classic and New Who. I guess technically Orphan 55 was an environmental story.
Yeah, but that one was shit.
Yeah, well. But also the Green Death has a nice environmental tinge to it.
I've only seen it once, but I remember it being pretty good.
Yeah, the ending though. But this is, well, it's not really where it starts, but I think it's certainly interesting. It tries to have a message, which is different. It's not a pure historical, it's just trying to point out some insecticides might be dangerous. And I thought this one quote was particularly, well, it's a bit on the nose, but it's also particularly amusing. It's a quote from Barbara, and I'm assuming episode 2. What would kill insects in a perfectly ordinary garden? I mean, pests one can understand, but surely it's wrong to kill bees and worms and things, isn't it?
Yeah, see, the thing is, I don't know, to me, bees and worms, you could also classify as pests. I realized, I guess there's some type of distinction, and I know that they serve purposes, but still, I'd probably still call them pests.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm allergic to bees, so my definition, bee is a negative thing. But that said, I'm not like a gardener, so I don't know what technically counts as like a gardening pest or not. I have no idea. But the idea is good. It's actually, speaking of Barbara, I think that's one of the best parts of the last couple of episodes, because when Barbara and Ian are sort of, they're like on top of a table in a laboratory, and they ran across these, I think they were wheat seeds. Naturally, they were doing some experiments with the seeds. They're covered in this insecticide, this pesticide. And Ian's not watching. He's looking at something else. And Barbara sort of, well, just marching around, picking up the seeds, trying to figure out what they are. And it turns out that the seeds are sort of covered with, well, like I said, they're covered with this insecticide. And so Ian's like, oh, hey, you shouldn't touch anything, Barbara. She had already let it go beforehand. And the funny thing is, Barbara was like about to tell Ian, like, hey, this is interesting, and just show him that, she was holding it. But he sort of like brushes her aside. He goes down to something else. not intentionally, but that's just how some men do back in the day. And for like most of the second and pretty much all of the last episode, Bob was like slowly dying of this poisoning from this insecticide that she hasn't told anyone about. She never told the doctor. She never told Barbara. She never told Ian. No one knows until she like faints, and the doctor's like, "Oh, hey, she must have touched it," which I found sort of funny.
You know, I think low-key, some of the most hilarious parts of this story was just how insistent Ian was to not touching the insecticide. Don't even look at it, it's that dangerous. I mean, it didn't get that bad, but that was almost the idea of it. Every time he'd bring it up, he would talk about it in the most dire of tones. For example, at one point he says, referring to a dead fly that had scared Barbara and actually made her faint earlier on, which, you know, I don't blame her for. She had the insecticide going through her, so she gets you faint once. I don't think it's the worst use of the fainting woman trope. In her circumstances, I completely get it. But there's a dead fly, and Ian says, "You can see the insecticide glistening on his legs. Pretty lethal stuff. That fly must have died the moment it landed." And Barbara's just listening to this with mounting horror, and she eventually screams, "Stop it! Stop it!"
Now, naturally, Ian's not trying to be insensitive, but he has more of a clinical scientific mindset, naturally, scientist sort of his background. I just laugh. It's like, it must have died the moment it landed. And like, out the while, Barbara's having like a mental breakdown. Like, that's some good stuff.
Yeah, honestly, I would say Planet of Giants, not the best toy, but it's not very long, and I would watch it just for this. I think it's that funny. I think it's pretty good acting on the actress of Barbara as well.
One thing that also stood out, I don't want to say negatively, it's just interesting to me, but naturally Classic Who had a bunch of cliffhangers, and they'd usually follow up naturally the next episode following after the cliffhanger. But this did something that I don't think I've seen very often in Classic Who, where at the beginning of the third episode, when they're sort of showing the old material, the cliffhanger, before it ended, it showed a scene that wasn't shown previously, a scene that wasn't in the cliffhanger of the last episode, but it was still, quote-unquote, part of the cliffhanger they're showing at the beginning of episode 3.
Yeah, they re-recorded what was filmed instead of just using the actual cliffhanger like they almost always do.
And that's the type of thing that you would see in like old-time serials, but it's not something that comes to mind when it comes to Classic Who. Now, I'm just saying it's a negative thing, but like the end of episode 2 makes it look like, oh hey, Susan and the doctor are going to drown, but then they clearly show in the beginning of episode 3, oh hey, they're just like in an overflow pipe, so they're completely okay. And it just felt sort of strange and a bit out of place.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very easy to notice, especially if you're just watching this toy in one sitting, which my brother and I ended up doing.
And this is a really small thing, but something of personal interest to me. It seems strange to me because there are moments of this story when the doctor refers to them being only like inches tall. And later on, there's something's mentioned as being like 40, 50 feet. And it seems strange to me that they want to use it in the metric system, because I guess I always assumed that being British, they would have used metric measurements. But apparently, based on my limited understanding, the UK didn't go over to the metric system until like, they didn't even necessarily start going over until like the mid to late 60s, and even up to like the 80s, there's still like some imperial system in there. So it's not particularly important. I just thought it was interesting. Like, I was sort of expecting to hear feet and inches in the British TV show from the 60s. Shows what I know about the UK.
Yeah, it's always fun, the type of research you do afterwards to see, wait, this was strange. I mean, for example, in this episode, they mentioned some random roller coaster ride in the UK.
Yeah, I did write it down, but that was so funny.
Like, Ian just says, oh, this was worse than being on this coaster. And I don't know what city it was. And it's just this random UK roller coaster.
It's like a topical reference that no one's going to know in like 10 years.
So it's just interesting, the type of things that you can find, especially from the older Doctor Who stories. Before we get to our final thoughts on this story and what the story it was, a quick trip to the timeline section of our show. As regular viewers of our show will know that How Does Wiki, which is a very useful source for all things Doctor Who, has a personal timeline for each Doctor not just the TV show, but also the extensive extended media ranging from the comic books, the comic strips, Big Finish and BBC audios, the multiple book ranges, and everything in between. Doctor Who canon is and has always been a completely jumbled mess, and it's just fun to see where this treasure discussion fit into the universe as a whole, because continuity in the narrative timeline has always been of personal interest to me, and hopefully to you. Hopefully this has made you actually want to say, hey, where's this trade fit in? But if not, maybe now is the time. So Planet of Giants, of course, being in between the Reign of Terror from Season 1 and Avon Manson, the Dalek Invasion of Earth, the last story of Susan. There's a lot more that happens in the world. Right before this story is The Thief of Sorwood, which is a short story in one of the Short Trips anthology books, Short Trips Past Tense, which came out in April 2004, and the story was written by Jonathan Morris. Now, if you are unfortunate enough to, like us, be in the United States, you might not have been lucky enough to see a physical copy of a Short Trips anthology that was done by Big Finish. These things, well, seemingly popular in the UK, and they probably sold well, are not cheap, especially in the United States. Every time I look a copy up, I'll be lucky if I can find one under $25, and there were 28 or 29 of these. Luckily, the last one is just a collection of stories that were printed previously, but all the others have completely new stories in each one, and these were printed, from 2002 to 2009 or so?
Yeah, and it's just a warning, because this is something that I didn't really know beforehand, but if you're ever interested in getting into like Doctor Who extended media and like Doctor Who books, if you're an American, now I have to imagine they're probably still a bit expensive maybe in the UK. It's a book from 2002, 2003, might be hard to find, but it's probably easy if you're British. But if you're an American trying to get into this stuff and you actually want to buy these books, it's going to be, well, as a kid say, expensive as fuck. It's expensive. So just bide your time and look for the deals.
Yeah, that's a very wise thing to do. And it's interesting, the Short Trips anthologies, because these books was the only place where you could read news stories of the first 8 Doctors after the BBC Past Doctor Adventures series ended, when the Revival series came on air. Because these are still being published up to 2009, and they had adventures from all 8 Doctors. Some books would skip a Doctor or two, not usually though. And in fact, after the last new one of these was published, because Big Finish weren't able to get the publishing rights for Doctor Who anymore, they of course were still doing the Doctor Who audios. In fact, the next book that had to do with a old classic Doctor was the one we previously discussed, The Wheel of Ice. That was the first classic Doctor book or story actually published since the last one of these came out in 2009 or so. And I just think that's a kind of funny coincidence. But unless you want to try to find a pirated copy of The Thief of Sorwood, have fun looking for Short Trips Past Tense, which was one of the many Big Finish anthology Doctor Who books from 2004. And right after this adventure, you get to enjoy another of the written word, this one being an actual full-length novel, The Time Travelers, which is seemingly one of the most boring names I've ever seen for Doctor Who media. But
that's not particularly inspired.
No, but the cover is pretty inspired. And this was the 73rd novel in the BBC Past Doctor Adventures series, which we just discussed. So 73rd is pretty close to the end of the series. What, did they have 76?
Yeah, 76, 75, something like that. I can't remember the exact number.
Yeah, this is very close to the end of the series. And in fact, it was released November 2005. So after the Revival series has already started airing. But this was written by Simon Guerra. Complete apologies, I cannot pronounce that last name. It's something closest to that. And like I said, it came out November 2005. And I think that's actually a really interesting book. Just plot-wise, it sounds fascinating. And also, I noticed at the end of this episode, usually these old school Doctor Who episodes, even to the Troughton time, always led into the next story on air, which sometimes would seemingly make it hard to fit all these books and stories and audio adventures in between them. Except this one doesn't. The Doctor just says, let's see where we've landed now. It doesn't show anything like the famous sign Dr. Bodies in the Revo that we see at the beginning of the Dalek invasion of Earth, which you would think would be an amazing cliffhanger leading into the next story. It doesn't show anything like that at all, which makes me think maybe that was one of the things that was cut. But either way, apparently this nav with the time travelers starts with the Doctor saying that line, so that's how we know it fits in between the two.
Yeah, and it's always interesting, especially with the Fourth Doctor. Think about Fourth Doctor expanded media.
Yeah, we actually have, I believe, 5 First Doctor novels.
Now, naturally, we haven't read any of them yet, but I have to say, I think pretty much all of them look legitimately interesting.
I mean, I don't know. Is there a novel that we have, or a novel that exists in any of the main ranges that you think that should look interesting?
I mean, sure, this, I think a Fifth Doctor book, like Zeta something, which, I mean, it looks fine. I'm not saying it looks bad. I'm just saying it doesn't, scream, hey, read me.
So, well, I mean, surprise. Your hatred for the Fifth Doctor is always...
It's not hatred, just have a personality, bruh, but he just doesn't.
He does. It's called kindness.
I was going to say it's called a flow mat, but that's okay. We'll talk about that's next lesson. But yeah, I think Planet of Giants, it's just a 3-episode story, so it's pretty short. And it's not overly amazing. I think it's a perfectly fun story. It's largely inoffensive. It's certainly not a bad story. It's fun. Barbara has some good material in the last couple of episodes. Susan shrieks with the best of them. It's not a story that does a whole lot for me, but I have a moderately decent time with it. I have no real complaints at all, really, when it comes to Planet of Giants, to be honest. I'm not saying I strongly love it, but it's a perfectly fine way to spend my time.
Yeah, no, this is almost the definition of a completely serviceable story. There's nothing really wrong with it. All the characters, I think, are completely characterized well. None of them seem strange. Barbara is amazing in this story. Ian's pretty good. Susan does what Susan does in these early stories, and the Doctor is in good form, almost dying climbing up a drain pipe. I don't think it'd have to be anybody's favorite story for the First Doctor, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's completely serviceable, and because it's 1 episode lesser, I think it's a very easy watch. Yes, the 3rd episode is kind of changed with the way that they cut the story into pieces, but it wasn't really the choice of the people who made the episode, so I think that can be forgiven. I don't know, I think it's on the whole pretty good, and it's also really interesting to note, this was the very first story of Doctor Who where they were in fact back in their own time, Barbara and Ian, except of course they were super small, so it's not like they could go back to their lives, because all throughout the first season, they were telling the Doctor, hey, get us back to our world. But the Doctor is completely unable to. He has no control over the TARDIS at this point in time. And so the time that they do happen to actually get back to England in the 1960s, this might have been maybe a little after 1963. Point is, though, the time they get here, they're small and they can't actually enjoy it. And I believe that, unless I'm very much mistaken, we don't actually see England in the 1960s again in Doctor Who until, I don't know, the War Machine. The Doctor, spoilers, was never actually able to get Ian and Barbara back. They had to use their own way to get back. So I just think that's really interesting. And plus, it's one of the few stories where the Doctor's in modern-day England, but he's not stopping an alien invasion or anything of the sort. He's just doing a very small, I would say murder mystery, but that's not really his concern. His concern is to just get everybody back to their normal size. So I think it's a very fascinating story in Doctor Who. I don't think they ever could have done this story really any later than this. So overall, I'd say it's some pretty good stuff here. Nothing amazing, but completely okay.
Yeah, if you don't have much experience with Classic Who, given that this one's only 3 episodes, I don't really see the harm in checking this one out. Like James said, it's not likely to amaze you, but I think it gets the job done. It shows you a little bit, at least, of each companion, what they bring to the table. One small thing, I think it's sort of strange. This at one point when they ran into a comical compound, and Ian's like, hey, this is beyond me. Hey, Doctor, what is it? Where Ian's supposed to be the science guy. And I get that maybe the comical compound, at least, because you can't see the whole thing, might be a bit more, it might not be his type of science. Maybe he's more physics and not chemistry. But I thought it was chemistry, but they just lump all of science into one. But I thought that one line was sort of strange because it sort of takes away what Ian's supposed to bring to the table. But my main point being that if you want sort of a taste of what the first Doctor on his farm was like, this might be worth seeing. It's certainly maybe a bit more approachable and digestible than like a 6-part story like the Dalek Invasion of Earth. Even though that one's generally seen as a classic, this one being a lot shorter, it might be easier to get into. So
yeah, this is very true. I will say, I do think the Dark Invasion of Earth is maybe a bit overhyped because most people, when they talk about it, talk about the very first episode and not the other 5, but we'll get into that.
I think they also talk about like the Aunt too, like the famous.
Well, yeah, they talk about the Aunt to make fun of it. Okay, they talk about the very ending scene, but they also make fun of the whole, all the Daleks are moving Earth and this science makes absolutely no sense. It's only a reminder of the two things. People ignore at the best all the rest, and at the worst they make fun of things like the Slayer and the science.
But as always, though, that is just our thoughts on Planet of Giants. If you've seen this one, or if you have any thoughts, naturally you can always let us know either here or on Twitter. We are at Brothers Mahoney if you are interested in following us. But before we head out, what did we have to cover next, James?
Next, we have the 12th release of the main range of Doctor Who from Big Finish, The Files of Vulcan, starring the 7th Doctor, Sylvester McCoy, of course, and not Ace, not Stooky Bill, but Mal, played, of course, by Bonnie Langford.
Lady Mal.
So this is going to be not like the usual thing you've seen with Sylvester McCoy in the, the 2 ones we've seen?
Yeah, Genocide Machine and Fearmonger. Yeah, this is what's interesting. So naturally, and we talked about this a bit in the Giggle, but Mal wasn't around that long in Classic Who, and when it comes to her time with the 7th Doctor, of the 4 stories she was there, I mean, 2 of them, and I sort of enjoyed time on the Rani, but let's be honest, it's not great. And we can maybe debate that later. It's a fun story, but I don't think it's a particularly good story. So you have 2 stories, Time on the Rani and Doubt and the Bannerman. And again, Doubt and the Bannerman has some amusing parts, but 2 stories that aren't particularly great in my opinion. And even Dragonfire, I don't particularly love Dragonfire either. So you pretty much only have one particularly noteworthy good story with Ma, which is Paradise Towers, and some people might fight me. I thought Paradise Towers was pretty fun.
I mean, she was also in Terror of the Railroad, so I would say it's more like 4.5 stories.
Yeah, but I'm talking about just her time with the 7th Doctor.
Ah, okay.
So it's going to be interesting. I'm actually really, really interested in listening to The Files of Vulcan to see a bit more of the dynamic between McCoy and Mal, because we didn't see like a lot of it. And
this was the season where the 7th Doctor was just some goofy comedian who wasn't at all characterized like he was in the last 2 seasons with Ace. So I have to imagine in the audio, and there's a lot more than this one. There's, I believe, something called Rod. There's a big finish later in the main range called Bang Bang a Boom, which I believe is over 2 hours. That's going to be exciting. I have to imagine almost all of these, maybe the Bang Bang a Boom, because that seems like it's set in really early 7th Doctor time. I have to imagine a lot of them, though, are going to make some reference to the Doctor, going to become a bit more manipulative in his future. I mean, that's what I would do if I was them. They do have the foresight, but it'll be interesting to see how they play out. Yeah, so I'm deeply curious about how fast the Vulcan will go. Like, obviously, the last one we talked about, insofar as Big Finish was concerned, was the apocalypse element, which I wasn't a big fan of. So I'm hoping that this is something that I have more enjoyment and more fun with, and I really think I will. Just, I enjoy the 7th Doctor. Mal isn't the companion I particularly rate highly, but in this scenario, I'm sort of hoping for good things. So I am legitimately looking forward to this one. But naturally, that's all we got. As always, this has been Michael. And I'm James.
We thank you for listening. We hope you have a nice night.